Hi, Eileen. Good morning to you. Good morning to all. I see a lot of questions and a lot of, I would say, passes from Paul. Also, this presentation, I'll try to do my best. And also, I will try to address perhaps some of the questions during the presentation. If we perhaps move on the starting point, I want to recap a bit on the why. Let's not forget, as Dimitri mentioned, this is a project. It's a Eurosystem new project, and it's always good to recap why we do it. I think Dimitri alluded to most of the elements. Perhaps the most important one, the starting point, is a strategic policy, I would say, of the ECB, but also the European authorities to support market innovation and the expressed market need. Innovation in itself, I would say, if you allow me, is not an end in itself, but it's a means to keep the financial market in Europe relevant and attractive. It's very important, while we do so from the ECB side, that we keep also relevant what we call the pivotal role of central bank money. Apologies for all the acronyms. I think they are well described in the presentation, but we love acronyms in the Eurosystem. So central bank money, it's an important integral part of financial market transactions. Some people call it the risk-free settlement asset. Basically, you use money on the balance sheet of the central banks, and as such, a whole, I would say, scope of the risks are eliminated. Of course, because there were some questions also in the chat, there is also in parallel complementary the commercial bank money activity, which should remain and will remain in the project in the two-tier financial market, let's say, structure. The third element, which is important, and it should not be surprising, is, of course, the Eurosystem and the ECB relevance in all this innovation. And when we say relevance, again, the perspective we take is that from a monetary policy and I would say interest rate mechanism perspective, our role, the central bank money role, should and could remain and be important for signaling let's say, economic messages and monetary policy messages to the market. Finally, all these elements is not surprising, and it's actually part of, I would say, the statute of the ECB is to support the wider policies in the European Union, and you are all familiar with the even more acronyms here, the CMU, the Capital Markets Union in the past, but also moving more towards the Savings and Investment Union. And not surprising in the current, I would say, challenging global geopolitical framework to maintain the international role of the euro. So I just want to recap this because there is an urgency and a clear mandate from the ECB Governing Council to move timely to the Pontes project, or what used to be called Track 1. And this leads us nicely to the next slide, I think, where it will give us a bit of more perspective on the timeline. Not sure who is pushing the slides, Aline. It takes a bit of time, I know. Okay, excellent, thank you. So indeed, we are now in, let's say, beginning of Q3, moving towards beginning of Q3, and we have a clear decision of the Governing Council to move on with the Pontes pilot phase. And here, what we are doing at the moment is we are fine-tuning user requirements, but we are already in parallel working with the development for going into production. Paul very nicely explained the trials and experiments. And now there's a clear, I would say, policy strategic decision to move forward to the next phase, which we hope to start by Q3 2026 and go into production with what we call a pilot phase. In a few minutes, you realize why we call it a pilot phase. There are certain limitations at the moment. But this is, I would say, a good balancing act between waiting for years or months to get it right and having a short time to market to eliminate, let's say, the risks of making the European market not relevant. What we are going to see in the coming months, basically between now and the go live of the pilot by Q3 26, as I said, is a specification of the requirements, and we'll come back to how we want to interact with you further beyond these focus sessions, but also acceptance testing, what we call acceptance testing within the Eurosystem, but also probably what is very important for most of you, user testing with the communities in Europe. And what you see perhaps as a innovation here around the milestone of the technical go live, there will be user testing before and after. We can have a long discussions on this agile approach, but the key message here is that we want to be, let's say, shorten the time to go live and facilitate most of you who are interested to go into production very soon. There are two important swim lanes in this slide, in addition to the pilot phase of the Pontes. I will start perhaps with the yellowish or orangey one on the top. In between, there is a possibility, subject to reaching out to the relevant national central banks, especially those who, let's say, operated the three solutions during the trials and experiment. Paul mentioned Banque de France, Pontes, Banca d'Italia, to continue, if needed, some trials and experiments between now and the pilot go live. This is a optionality. We're not going to be very transparent. We're not going to focus a lot into this activity, but it's something which could be possible subject to availability of the three national central banks and further discussion with the Eurosystem. Now, the other important, let's call it more medium-term perspective in this slide is certain enhancements on which I'm going to speak in a few minutes that we will need to consider, subject to governing council discussion, of course, and move forward beyond the pilot phase. Here, we are still into, I would say, the exploratory phase. We try to build concrete user requirements, and we need to understand what would it take to take the pilot phase, let's call it, to the next operational phase. Some people call it the production grade system offered by the Eurosystem. Again, this is a kind of appetizer for the moment, but it's an important work that goes on in parallel. Moving to the next slide, which is, I think, comes nicely, and I mentioned it to some extent. Here, it's the interaction, the need for a structured interaction between the Eurosystem and the relevant stakeholders. Again, moving into a project organization, it will not be surprising to most of you that we want to interact with internal and external stakeholders, again, as I said, in a structured way. And we are looking at it in similar way to what we've done with target services in the past. So there will be a Pontes working group focusing, I would say, in the internal kitchen, if I can use the term, and it will include the ECB and the national central banks, which basically are part of the central bank money liquidity provision. And there will be also another working group, contact group, the Pontes contact group. And I think this is probably what is of interest to this session today. There is a call of interest, expression of interest that you are going to see on the website of the ECB shortly, could be today or tomorrow. And the idea here is to, similar to what happened to some extent to the exploratory phase last year, to engage with the market in defining, assessing, establishing user requirements for the production, I would say, great service of the Eurosystem to the market. We will rely a lot on this group. I think some of you have experience in the past with that, and also it's not surprising we use it for other interactions. Is it like the AMISECO group for the target services, or the other market contact groups for the monetary policy activities of the Eurosystem. The deadline for submitting applications to this group is the 29th of August. I'm sure, I don't see the chat, Elena, at the moment. I'm sure everybody will be asking, am I eligible to participate? Am I eligible to be in the pilot phase? We'll come back to that in a few minutes. The idea here, instead of planning, is to say that the kickoff meeting is planned to start approximately in mid-October 2025. Now, if we move perhaps more a deep dive as much as we can, of course, in such a big focus session in what exactly will be the pilot phase, I would say, operational and functional modalities, if you can use the word, you can see it on this slide. I think all very nicely explain the three solutions in the exploratory phase until November 24. Here, what we plan for next year is to use the best elements of the three solutions and facilitate an interoperable interaction. In the past times, people used to call it interface interaction between DLT market platforms and the target services, where the central bank money settlement and finality will take place. This is very important, and perhaps it addresses some of the questions I saw in the chat. So basically, through the API application programming interfaces and the hash-link protocol, DLT operators and platforms will be able to manage the delivery of the digital asset outside the target services, or payment outside the target services, and by the interface to the target services, either have cash settlement in the Eurosystem DLT, or by the interface or what used to be called trigger solution in the past, have direct central bank cash settlement within the RTGS, the real-time gross settlement system of the target services. Is it the best solution? I would say, given the experience we gathered in the previous year, it's a good one, and it uses it allows us to be agile, and it allows many of you to interact with the Eurosystem. Now we can discuss what enhancements this can take, but perhaps before doing so, a few more details on this slide. I think come in the next one. It's important, I think, to mention to highlight the dual settlement model. Basically, as I said, settlement can take place in the DLT cash outside the target services with pre-funding and with finality later in T2, or directly in a typical, I would say, similar to what happens today in T2, in a similar way, direct settlement within the target services. It's important to highlight that the DVP element, the delivery versus payment element of this arrangement, will be established by the so-called hash-link protocol with cryptographic technology. I think we can perhaps deep dive into that in another session, or perhaps in the market contact group. But this is key and very important for the safety and what some people call atomicity of the transaction once we go live. And finally, we should also mention that certain automation will take place also between the trigger solution and the target 2 in order to make sure that there is more efficient compared to the trials and experiments. Now, in the next slide, a very natural, typical question that comes is what will be the framework of this pilot phase? Are we already into the target guideline? Are we into target services? I would say that the pilot phase, being by definition a pilot phase, will have certain limitations. And the idea here, also in order to make it timely and delivered to the market, is not to let's say, redo from scratch the whole framework of the target services, but keep them as they are and have a dedicated, let's say, functional operation and regulatory framework for the pilot phase, similar to what happened in the exploratory phase with trials and experiments. Of course, a typical example here, when we look at the operational framework of the pilot phase and operating for target services, you can imagine we focus a lot into that. There will be a specific terms of reference document, and it's something that typically we need also to check with the market in due course to explain the operational schedule, specific potentially volumetric limits to the pilot phase, and also what happens if extremely important for us in case of, let's say, emergencies or I would say problems during operation. So all these will be shared to the market, presented, and shared with you in due course. Now, a few words in the next slide on the scope of the activities and the use cases. That's also a typical question very, very often comes. I would say it will not be much different to the exploratory phase. We have the typical DVP, delivery versus payment use case. What is here very clear is to explain that the D leg of the transaction delivery will take place outside Pontes or outside the project and the operations of the Eurosystem, and the payment, the cash side, will be part of the Pontes. This is very important, and I think it relates to the question mentioned earlier to Paul, and I'm sure Olga and the colleagues will explain more the API and the long-term deliberations here. We refer here to primary and secondary market operations and transactions, and I recall there was even in the chat a question about that. Why so much focus on primary versus secondary? I would say, as Eurosystem, we're neutral. It's up to you. It's up to the market. It's up to the DLT platforms you are establishing, or you will be established, and whether they are for issuing instruments, financial instruments, or for secondary market trading. This is something that you have to decide and let's say influence the use cases. So regarding perhaps the payment side, the pilot solution also covers any payment transactions. Again, that's probably quite important to highlight in Europe for the pilot phase, and in central bank money. Again, for the P side of the transaction, which is within our systems, we come back to that in terms of enhancements because it's important to highlight here that for the short-term, I would say, time to market and the framework, the operational framework that we need to establish very soon, we really focus only on euro transactions in central bank money. Again, the complete list, because of course we can speak about corporate actions, we can speak about, when you speak about securities transactions or financial transactions, the list can be exhaustive, but we will try to be more detailed and structured in forthcoming interactions with you. Now, the next slide, the next two slides, I would say, focus perhaps on one of the key questions of the focus session today, and this is the eligibility. What assets, what participants, what platforms can connect to Pontes? Here on this slide, let's focus a bit on the assets and the participants, market participants, and on the next one, we'll focus a bit more on the DLT operators. So again, not many surprises here when it comes to eligible assets. The typical categories of financial instruments as defined by MiFID would be, let's say, eligible for DVP transactions in Pontes. It's not far away from what we do also with the other target services. And also in terms of eligible market participants, and here probably we speak, just to be very clear, access to central bank money. Basically, again, as I mentioned earlier, we are not preparing any revolution between now and next year. Just to be very precise, the target guideline, it's a public document you can find on the ECB website, explains very clearly who has access to central bank money balances in the Eurosystem through your national central banks, including the recent developments for non-bank access to central bank money. Again, the key message here is that we stick to the target guideline for the time being. And of course, the target guideline is subject to updates and amendments as needed and as decided by the Governing Council. I think what is more, and this will not be a surprise to anybody, I assume, what is more interesting perhaps is the next slide, which focuses on the eligibility criteria, but for the platforms. And here, just to be very clear, we have two terms, I think. We speak about market DLT platforms and operators of the DLT platform. And sometimes the words are used a bit interchangeably. Now, the key message here is that at least for the pilot phase, we are not changing the rules of the game. Basically, we follow what was publicly available and decided in the exploratory phase. Basically, central securities depositories under the CSDR operating SSS or based on the DLT, operators of DLT settlement systems, DSS. We also have to learn the new terminology, or DLT trading settlement system, DTSS, as let's say described and authorized in the pilot, in the DLT pilot regulation of the European Commission, will also be, of course, eligible for participation. Any other payment systems overseen by the Eurosystem also would be available, could be eligible for participation. CCPs authorized under EMIR, I think there was also a question about that in the chat, potentially decide to operate a DLT platform. And finally, any credit institution that was also not new, not different to what happened in the exploratory phase, authorized under legal frameworks, also national legal frameworks, but also European ones, will be subject, let's say, will be eligible to apply and participate to the pilot phase. Now, this is work in progress, I would say. We will have a lot of certainty, stability that this will remain as such. We still need to bring the overall strategy on eligibility, also for the enhancement beyond the pilot phase, and eventually the long term in the API, I would say, activities. So you will hear soon and formally from us on this, also after checking with the ECB decision-making bodies. But this is a good base for managing expectations for planning activities for next year for the pilot phase. Now, if we move to the last slide, I promise, Eli, will not keep people bombard them a lot with slides. This is the last one. No, it's not the last one. This is the last one in the. No, let me. Oh, it is the last one. Okay. Perhaps on the enhancements, I mentioned a bit that there are certain limitations when it comes to the Pontes pilot. A typical one is that settlement finality only takes place on the cash side, only takes place within the target services. We mentioned the dual settlement model that has certain limitations in terms of, let's say, multiplicity of operations and crisis management. So what we are exploring at the moment, in parallel to the Pontes pilot phase, the go live of next year, what we are exploring in a bit more medium-term horizon is how we can already enhance what we plan for the pilot phase. And here the idea, and this is still a work in progress, I underline that, is that we would like to explore how to integrate what I explained a few minutes ago on the Pontes functionality within the target services. Dimitri mentioned the magic triangle of payments, securities, collateral, retail and wholesale payments, and the usage of a single liquidity cash pool in central bank money. So it's really, I would say, difficult to expect that moving forward with production grade systems, we should not bring the DLT innovative part of the financial market into the single liquidity pool of central bank money. So this is what is behind this enhancement. We also, part of that is we try to look into how the tokenized form and format of central bank money will be part, let's say, of the target services. As you recall in the previous slide, the tokenized cash, it's outside, basically, the central bank finality ecosystem at the moment. So how can we bring it within the target services, within the legal, operational, functional, and regulatory framework of the target services? And of course, when we look at more better integration with the monetary policy and the remuneration policies of the Eurosystem, how we can keep liquidity overnight, for example, something which is not foreseen for the Pontes pilot phase. And the final element, which I mentioned the previous slides, as part of one can consider limitations of the short term, is the euro-only settlement central bank money. Looking at the potential enhancements, we would like to look into the multi-currency design, of course, focusing obviously as central bank money with the currencies that are currently into target services. You are aware, of course, that beyond the euro, the Danish krona, as of April this year, is part of all target services, and also the Swedish krona is part of TIPS, but is moving also especially into T2 in the coming years. And this is not the end of the journey. You may be aware that in the target services, there is more interest for more currencies in the context of the European neighborhood, of course, to be part of the target services. So an enhancement to the pilot phase will also be an enhancement to a multi-currency format. Okay, I think, Eileen, with this one, more or less I covered what we plan, I would say, in the next 12 to 14 months kind of horizon. Happy to take any questions, Eileen, if you want to share some with me,
I'm here with you, George.
Later, as you like.
I'm here with you. So it's clear when I look at the chat and the questions we're getting, no one in Europe has gone on holiday. So we're all here. We're all bombarding with questions. There's a number of, so I'll just, let George breathe here for a second. I hope he has some water stacked up with him. There seems to be, so first of all, let's just clarify this. There seems to be a number of questions on the famous call. So call for participants in the market contact group. As George mentioned, this is coming. Hold on, everybody. We will publish this. So you have not missed the link. It is to be published. So do not worry, we will publish it in the coming days. So, as I said in the beginning, stay tuned on our social media platforms. If you follow the LinkedIn group, you will see it there firsthand, and also our newsletter. So it was smart to take a photo of that shot at the beginning. That will come. George, also on the call, there's been a lot of questions on the who, but I think we just you just talked a little bit about that, who can participate, and then compared to the exploratory work, there's a question here. Basically, do you need to have taken part in the exploratory work in order to take part in the Pontes pilot? Can you maybe say a word on that?
Yeah. No, thank you, Eileen. I was expecting that. I would perhaps go back to the eligibility slide and the platforms, perhaps. That's the key slide, exactly. So I think, yeah, no, it's the... Okay. So basically the slide that explains, and I understand, Eileen, that these slides will be publicly available. The slide that explains which entities authorize.
Yeah, so 2 forward, I think. Yeah, this one.
The next
right?
one. It's the next one.
One.
So basically, the eligibility criteria, I would say, are quite stable. If you look at this slide, more or less, you have a ticket to apply, if I can say like that. There will not be there will be no pre-requirement that you should have been in the exploratory phase, if this is the question. What I mentioned is that these eligibility criteria do not differ from the exploratory phase. That was my point of the pilot. Now, of course, we are very happy and keen to have a strong interest of market actors, stakeholders to participate. But I think we'll have also a difficult act to make it manageable. A contact group of, I would say, 60, 70, 80 people in our experience may not be ideal. So we need to manage a little bit the bandwidth, or we may need to have a rotating participation. But we want to engage all of you, obviously. And I would say a final message, perhaps, Eileen, is I would say participate or apply if you plan to participate and if you plan to contribute. If it is about listening and being informed, I think Eileen is your agent. Eileen will organize a focus session.
We will.
And you will be able to have access. So more of that, let's wait for the call of interest. And I think Eileen can say safely, you can always reach out to us bilaterally and ask questions before you apply, during your application, and we can fine-tune the framework.
Exactly. Thank you, George. Because there was also a few questions on the for the pilot phase again. So I think, I think these slides will help people a lot, because a lot of questions were coming in before you were showing the slides. So I trust that many of the questions you have already covered with the slides. And remember, everyone, the slides will be published together with the recording. So you will be able to view all this. George, there's a few questions about basically the eligibility, but the rules of the games are pretty much the same for the pilot, Pontes pilot, as for the test and trials, or how does that work?
Exactly. So that's what I said. This slide 35 does not change much from what we have in exploratory phase. I think the wording is a little bit more detailed, and we hope it's a little bit clearer. I would say, Eileen, if people take this back as homework and check with the compliance offices and officers, they will know where do they belong in the 5
Excellent.
criteria. Of course, what we mentioned, perhaps, Eileen, to preempt any other questions, moving forward beyond the pilot phase into the enhancements, considerations, or further project, or into the APIA, the Eurosystem will communicate a more, I would say, wider policy, let's say, communication on the eligibility, because things may be fine-tuned as we move forward in the next years. But for the pilot, for next year, we are on stable grounds, I would say.
Super. George, there's also a few questions on the multi-currency design, because, of course, on your last slide, you're speaking about the longer-term potential multi-currency design here. But what about the Pontes pilot? Is that multi-currency, or are we talking euro here? That's a question.
Exactly. I think I underline it, but I can reiterate it, of course. So for the pilot phase, so the plan is to go live by Q3 2026. And when we look at the time between now and that go live time, the Eurosystem decided to focus on the euro settlement in target services, so euro only. Now, what happens, let's say, outside the target services? I would leave it to the DLT platforms and operators and use cases. But when we speak about the cash leg, the pilot phase will be euro only. But one of the enhancements we are already looking at beyond the pilot phase is the multi-currency design. And here, Elin, I underline just for clarity, managing expectations, we speak about central bank money, so we speak about the currencies connected to the target services. But we can clarify more
exactly as we move on.
In more iterations in the specific.
This is not going to be the only focus sessions we do on this topic, I am sure. But George, just maybe I see we have a time issue, but maybe just can you clarify a little bit about the operating hours on the pilot phase? 24/7, what are we talking here? Overnight balance? Can you clarify a bit?
That's a good question. Indeed, and we know we are very much aware of the 24/7 question. By the way, there is even a survey of the ECB, a public survey at the moment looking into the future, the 24/7 for target services. So again, sorry to repeat myself, between now and next year, we speak about stable operational framework of the target services, and we are based on the cutoff and timelines of T2 and the target services in order to go live with something, in order to all of us as a community in Europe to go live. Beyond that, we speak about enhancements, and there will be enhancements in the Pontes of the future, let's call it like that, and in the target services. So all the scenarios are open, but let's take it in a modular way, step by step. I hope I was clear, Elina.
Perfect. Thank you.